I'm from Cork on the very south coast, a little village called Carrigaline, about 10 miles outside Cork City. You'd drive through it if you were going to Crosshaven. My family, is all from Cork and Kerry. My granddad is from Kerry, Abbey Dorney, near to Tralee. Anybody knows it. When I was in school, I felt like I was quite exotic because I had one grandparent from County Kerry, and I felt like that made me half foreign. I was very excited about that. Where I was from and the kind of village in the Ireland I grew up in was very definitely very local. There was somebody in the class who had a mother from Dublin, and somebody in the class who had parents from Monaghan and Cavan. But most people were all Cork born and bred, and families going back and going back. We grew up with Irish and English, so the Irish language is very important to me. My grammar's awful, but the language sits in me like a breath. I really need to hear the language and to be part of the language. That is both a personal thing as well as a political thing for me. I think the suppression of languages and the denial of them, whether that's by the Dublin government or formally by the Stormont government, I think is something that needs to be taken very seriously. But my mother was very sick when I was young. And so for a few hours a day, from the age of 2 to 4, I was looked after by a woman who was from Ballyferret or Ballynairtairig, out at the tip of the Dingle Peninsula. And I thought she was about 200. I thought she was ancient. I called her Banatee. I thought that was her name. It just means woman of the house. Landlady, I suppose, is how you translate that. But anyway, my dad said that he heard her once try to speak English. She had no English, really. She had some words, but she had absolutely no idea how to speak the English language. And so for, 3 or 4 hours a day from the age of 2, I was with her. And so I arrived in primary school, fluent in the way that 5-year-olds are, in 2 languages, but not knowing that I was fluent. And then, I mean, there's all kinds of praises of the Irish language curriculum in terms of poetry and song, and then critiques as well, in the sense of at 6 we were learning what the subjunctive was. I didn't really know what the subjunctive was till I was 16, really, but we were learning off long lists that I never really knew how to understand. I'm not sure would I have had as much of a love for it had I not arrived in school speaking it already. And half the time what I had to do was put out the lessons I was learning and speak what I knew to be true with the language that was in me already. But then as I've gotten older, I've begun to look to the grammar books and try to polish up the terrible mistakes I make. I do notice how much more concrete my metaphors become when I'm speaking in Irish. Partly that's, I think, because Irish is a language that lends itself to that. And it's also a result of my my limited vocabulary. So I have a smaller pool of things to choose from. So therefore, you're limited in that way. So you have to find ways to describe something, and you usually describe something by concrete metaphor. But yeah, there's something about speaking Irish in Ireland that I think is a statement about the question of how do we recognize that there's a language that has been spoken here and evolving here for thousands of years? And how do we connect with the ordinary women and men who have been part of generations upon generations of trying to survive hunger, trying to survive general life, trying to survive empire? How do we connect with that old story? That is so important to me.
It's also, how do we, considering our choice, and I know that I asked you to name tonight's session, but it's also a language that is very connected and rooted in nature.
It is, yeah. There are such, stunning things to think about when it comes to the question of the Irish language. For years, I had been interested in nature poetry, but not entirely sure how I would find a way in. I grew up in the countryside, so it's not like I'm not a city boy, even though I've lived in cities now for most of my adult life. And a friend of mine had been saying to me, when are you going to find your way in to write some nature poetry? And I wasn't sure. And this whole last year, obviously in lockdown, like lots of us, I've been in the same place for most of the time, which is unusual. That hasn't been the way for me for the last 20 years. And somebody sent me a tweet once of the names for birds in Irish. And it was such an extraordinary thing to look at the name for birds in Irish, some of which I knew and others of which were new to me. So the wren is the little brown druid on Drid John. And then the finches, I'm going to get some of these wrong, but finches, I think the bullfinch is the scarlet sound of the wood, and the green finch is the light on the oak. These are the ways that you describe these. So they're not kind of described by genus, they're described by some visual element of their color. And the robin is spideog, and spideog comes from an etymology implying delight or mischievous. And when you see the delight and mischievousness and the downright bullying, really, of the robins and their territorial nature, you see something quite amazing. And the language itself holds within it a point of view into the world, which isn't unique, of course. Whatever language you're speaking, there's going to be great riches in it. But there's something beautiful about the particularity of that when it comes to, for instance, elements of nature and animals. There's a family of hares just live in the trees nearby here. And so last year I got to see loads of hares. There was a parent couple, and then they had some leverets, 2 leverets. And so regularly enough, you'd see all 4 of them around the place, which I think was quite unusual. Sometimes I'd see the two younger ones, and they were like puppies. They would play with each other. They'd chase the blackbird, and the blackbird would move away a little bit, but not too far. It was a total delight. And the hares are called Angioria, the low deer, because when you see a hare, you realize a bunny it is not. They can reach up to 50 miles an hour when they're sprinting. You see the extraordinary power of their legs. And I think for me, being located in nature so particularly over the last year, as well as then having the tool of the language to consider what is the word for this creature that has evolved over hundreds of years and been used for hundreds of years, there's something really beautiful about that. So since 65 to now, Corrymeela has about 10,000 people a year coming through in programs of peace and reconciliation. And mostly peace and reconciliation looks like a desperate attempt to find a way to argue with each other about political, serious matters, to argue with each other in a way where you are not using the recourse to threat. So peace and reconciliation can sound like daisy chains and loveliness. It's rarely either of those things. Mostly peace and reconciliation is sitting in a room with somebody where you think, I feel compromised sitting in the room with them, but I think we might need to learn to talk to each other so that we don't rip each other apart. And that is the terrible nature of empire, the terrible nature of the impact of partition, and the terrible nature of campaigns that seek to fight a campaign through bombs rather than dialogue. And so this is a really extraordinary work that I was very lucky to be brought into. I joined Corrymeela really at the age, or when I moved to Belfast in 2002, got involved as poet in residence, sitting in on groups of people describing being victims of war, describing being a British Army soldier, describing being brought into the IRA, describing border crossings, describing their houses being raided by the British Army, etc. People with all kinds of accusations back and forth, sitting in the same room with each other. And I was there as poet in residence to try to find a way to respond to what people were saying through the medium of poetry. Not to try to make it all okay, because that's not the aim, but to find a way where you can hold the tension well with each other and hold the tension of living with each other in a contested space in a way that's fruitful. So I was poet in residence there on a freelance basis for a long time. And then in 2014, I became leader and led it for the next 5 years till 2019. I trained in conflict mediation, I should say that. So I do have a professional interest in conflict mediation, particularly in the realm of group mediation. So 2 people fighting with each other doesn't actually interest me that much. I love walking into a room full of people who are at loggerheads with each other. That absolutely thrills me. Peacemaking and conflict resolution and poetry are about finding ways to shape words in a way that might make something seem sharper as well as seem safer. Peace language is not vague or fluffy. It's absolutely direct. To wage peace with each other, we have to find the capacity to say to each other what we say about each other, but hopefully to say it in a way where it can be fruitful. So peacemaking is exhausting and thrilling and really demanding. And so that's the first thing to say, is that both peacemaking and poetry are all about honing language and sharpening your language, not being fluffy, but being very direct and very particular. And the second is that in conflict mediation, you're always being taught as a mediator this idea of framing. How can you frame this conflict with you know, and that, I mean, if there's people here who are artists, visual artists, I'm sure you'll be very familiar with the idea of framing, that the question as to how you frame something and the way you frame something can entirely change the experience of a piece of art that's being displayed. And it's the same way within conflict. Somebody will come in and say, because of this that happened last year, here's the following way within which I hold something against you. Somebody else will say, because this other thing has been happening for 100 years, here's what I hold against you. And finding a way, how do you frame the dynamics of power in a room? How do you do that? And the art of visual art, as well as the art of poetry, is always looking for a way to frame what you're holding in form. And so I find the idea of both language as well as form to be relevant in the context of poetry, as well as relevant in the context of conflict resolution. One of my absolute commitments in conflict resolution is to name power disparities. Mm-hmm. Some people want to argue that their opinion should be valid. Other people are trying to argue for the fact that they shouldn't be murdered in homophobic attacks. Those are not equal but opposite. They are completely disparate. Mm-hmm. However, in the room, typically the people with the most power also exhibit the most fear. And so strangely and annoyingly, the people with the most amount of power and the least to lose, you have to do the most convincing of them to take a tiny step. Mm-hmm. And that interests me enormously. When you're looking at a situation in a room where you've got people who are at conflict with each other, typically the people with the most amount of conflict will want to say, look, everybody here has hurt each other. Just, you know, I've been hurt by you, you've been hurt by me. Lovely, you know, 50-50, you know. And typically, there are occasions when that's true, but it's rare. Typically, you have a situation in a room where one part of the room, in a room of conflict, one part of the room has been hurt on a seriously fundamental level, and another part of the room are beginning to feel like they're being challenged, and they'll say that that's tantamount to persecution. And what we need to do is to come up with measurements to say, actually, it won't diminish your cause to state that the suffering has been unequal in this context here. Mm-hmm. You are feeling awkward, and I understand that is awkward, and that's not a nice place to feel. Somebody else is feeling threatened, and that's, you know, in terms of their physical safety or their life. And those are two totally separate things. And to bring groups to get to the level of being able to say that is a really important thing. And then as well, to find a way where the people in the room with the most amount of power and privilege can recognize that they have power and privilege. And also regularly, the way that they recognize that is when the people who are actually about to lose the most, who have had the most to suffer, are themselves the one to say, we're not out to persecute you. We're not out to do to you what you've been doing to us. We just want to be safe. And it's a strange thing that the people under the most pressure are usually the ones called upon to make the most assurances of the other side's safety. And that interests me. I don't like it. If I was designing the world, I wouldn't design it like that. If I was able to wave a wand and come up with some way of describing human dynamics, I wouldn't do it like that. But over and over again, you see it. So you see men. I might be a gay man, but I'm a white man. And you see ways within which men might be being challenged about the presence of a certain masculinist culture in society. And suddenly a bunch of men will go, God, no, it's men are being persecuted. You know, it's the age of the persecution of men. And those are
it's a witch hunt.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Those are throwaway jokes, but I find them very interesting and will always seize on them to say, let's pay attention to this. Be accountable for what you've just said. Do you believe that? Are you implying that you're about to be treated the way that you've treated women for a long time, in the sense of that you won't be able to do B, but go on down and to go, actually, women are not going to do that. Women are looking for equity and equality, whereas what you're speaking about is pretending that if you can say that you're being persecuted, that therefore you have no accountability. And to map out those tiny demonstrations of power. And power occurs like that in so many different rooms. And I find gentleness to be an important tool to use within it, because we have proven to ourselves easily that when we escalate things, we find it difficult to listen. And so for me, being gentle and being calm is a vehicle for being able to say some pretty brutal things.